Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here to talk about season 1, episode 1 of Vikings. Really, I was going to sit down and cement and watch the whole first season, but really, when looking at it, like my ears were just like, whoa, on this day. So really, I was just like okay, like I want to try to at least start to watch this, but man, my like there was something about just like sound today, how everything was like way louder than it normally would be, and so justifiably I was like, okay, like I need to rest my ears a little bit and just kind of like at least get to the first episode of this because I wanted to watch this for I don't know how long. So my fascination with this show was ultimately tied to a WWE wrestler, ultimately Adam Copeland Edge. Ultimately, I had probably at some point mentioned about him also being on the show Haven. And so that's what tied me to get into that show. And for Vikings, easily Adam again was another kind of crux of me wanting to watch this show. And going into this, I have some crow to eat. At some point, I'd probably talked about Edge's theme song, and I'd probably also talked about Christian, how I just called him at some point Jay, only knowing that Jay is a name that Edge would call him via the podcast, knowing very well later on Christian's actual name is Jason Riso or Riso. If I'm in pronouncing that, I apologize, Christian. I apologize, Jason. And here's also the thing. Here's some crow that I have to eat because I feel like I've probably pronounced someone's theme song quite possibly wrong. You think you know me. On this day, I see clearly. Everything has come to life. Bitter place and broken dreams, and we'll leave it all behind. I know the beginning of the second part, but after that, it eventually. There are some good parts about that song that I do enjoy, but I think the song eventually is quite complex, and that's also what a lot of people can like about it. So here's the thing, Adam Copeland, I researched this and I found out that Adam isn't on the show till season 5, and I'm like, oh no. Oh no. He comes in as a character which last name is Flatnose, which I thought was interesting. As well as when I just started to scroll through the IMDb of this cast, I'm like, oh my god, there is some interesting interesting characters in this show that I have not yet to see yet. Because I've seen shows like Tudor, I've seen of course, Final Girls I saw recently with Alexander Ludwig. Even the guy that is the villain in one of the Beverly Hills Cop movies was actually a character in this show, and I was like, oh my god, this is actually awesome. Besides all that, we are now to talk about this show and talk about this first episode. I think this show is probably hands down like the best like time period piece show, which I sadly only have gotten to see one episode of yet, because it actually explains stuff. It actually explains stuff to the viewer for which if they don't understand. What a simple concept that is. Because I don't know how many times I'm like, okay, why is it that everyone throws fruit at people when they're the villain and they're walking down and they're doing that trot of shame, and everyone's throwing fruit and stuff at them? Like, man, isn't that like, shouldn't you be saving all that up? No, you have to do it or you're going to be fined. Oh my god, the justification of things. Showcasing how people are going to travel via a boat. And there's also some romanticism in this show that I actually liked. Because I like the romance of it, sadly enough. We have Travis Fimmel, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Ragnar? Is that short for Ragnarok? Was he named after that, I would assume? Here's the thing. I think if the first episode doesn't sell you on this show, then I don't think anything will. I love the explanation of things. I even like the very beginning of this like battle sequence where all of a sudden people were lifted up in the air. I'm like, wow. Okay, I like supernatural stuff. I like ghost things. This is interesting. Uh that was There was so much fascinating stuff within this first episode, and I hope I will be able to remember it all for all of you to. I kind of glossed over it, but like if anything, I'd also recently saw American Gods, were in the very beginning of in the very beginning of American Gods, which is on Stars. Vikings is currently on Hulu. You can check it out via that, or dare in fact buy the whole entire season if eventually you want to find that you are just like, oh my god, I'm enthralled with this, and I just because ultimately I like stuff like The Witcher. I like stuff that is like Game of Thrones, and this is simplistic and romantic, and yeah, uh, that is the best point about it. We also have a king within this called Earl, who I believe is Gabriel Bayern. I'm probably mispronouncing that. I know him from the movie Cool World, or uh, Man in the Iron Mask, which is Leonardo DiCaprio. He plays D'Artagnan. Yeah, I love that film. Great film. If people haven't seen it, eventually, maybe at some point, I will review it because there's something about that, like people that start to like grow to more than just respect one another, just like love one another and be loyal to people is what I like about Man in the Iron Mask. So we have in this show a mainly focused, seemingly in this first episode, between characters of Ragnar and Rollo, I believe. If I'm mispronouncing them, brothers that are battling and then ultimately trying to get their way onto the seas. Because ultimately they want to travel west because east isn't working out for them. So all that it will take is ultimately a nod of the king to get them there. But yeah, I thought that this was like, I was like, man, I like there's so many good shows. There's so many good shows. That's the problem, is there's so many good things that I find enjoyable, and then I'm just so heartbroken when I'm like, but I want to go back to this, or I want to watch this more, and then I'm like, but I'm doing this an injustice by not. So, anyways, I'm gonna have a problem pronouncing this. Catherine Winnick. I'm having problem actually pronouncing her actual name in the show. Lagertha? 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 Is that uh, some pronouncing maybe goofy within this? Alexander Ludwig, I think, plays Bjorn. Anyways, interesting enough, some interesting names via the time and this and that. So let's go into spoilers about this because I really wanna talk about some of the kind of other things that I saw via this episode. There might have been some things that got lost on me. Like there were some things that I think that I had to pedal back and rewatch, either because like I couldn't like there was like I was just like I was trying to adjust my ears, or because there was like a bunch of sound all going at the same time while I was watching this. So I was trying to like what did they say here? I want to rewatch that again just so I can hear that little bit and talk about it. So let's go into that delicious spoiler time because I want to talk about some of this stuff. Uh, Really, this is probably the best kind of time period piece to me, with the exclusion of just like, well, what about Back to the Futures and all? Via the melee of things, via the like, there doesn't have to always be like a big sword battle or whatever in all these kinds of films. Or a lot of these shows, which you can see this show on Hulu again if you haven't already seen it. There doesn't have to be a big battle. If anything, it's just explaining stuff finally. That is what this is interesting going into. It doesn't have to be a Braveheart like moment where you have 1,200 guys flashing their butts at anybody. No. It just has to just be different enough. And that is what this show is. Different enough. So, spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time getting to spoil this show. This first episode. So, reasonably, in the very beginning of this episode, we have a battle where ultimately we find out that Ragnar and Rollo are brothers. And then ultimately we see when people are dying in the battle, like people are getting lifted up via these spirits into the sky, which I'm like, okay, so this has some Norse mythology. So I'm assuming they're going to Valhalla. And yeah, that's eventually where, when everybody says that when somebody dies in here, they go to Valhalla. And I'm like, okay, I've seen some Thor stuff. I can understand what that is, because ultimately they reference Odin's eye and like giving up, that Odin had to give up his eye and stuff like, in a reference that Ragnar would give up more than his eye for anyone. So we have in here Ragnar, who eventually is with his wife and his son, and I really like, these were very tender and very sweet moments. If anything, of course, Ragnar laying next to his wife, ultimately finally getting some bedroom business, or laying on a seemingly sheets of sorts. And so reasonably, Ragnar's wife mentions him. It's like, oh, well, or like Ragnar eventually mentions like, oh, well, it was good that we had this, but I can go without it for a few days. And then it mentions that his wife in his dream was giving him blood pudding, which basically meant that she was giving him his heart, which I was like, oh man, this is really nice. This is really nice. So, because ultimately everything about them is like really how much they love one another, and I thought that that was fascinating, that sequence. Pushing on to eventually Catherine ending up having to take out two men. It seems like we found out that she is a very good blacksmith. That she's a shield maker, I believe. And from what is said within the first episode, and we have it to where she is going and taking out two men. She freaking uh, has a part of a sword that has seemingly been burnt by sitting into the fire, and takes out one guy with that, and then ultimately has some hooks and stuff to take out both of these men. In the end, they run away. So eventually, within this town, we find Earl, seemingly their king, Gabriel, eventually sitting down, and I'm like, oh, he's the king of this, because like you can tell he has a throne, he has women next to him. Everyone's going to him for information, or going to him for anything, and reasonably he's also the person that if there's ever anyone in the town that people want to seek a person dead, then that guy is brought to him. Here's the fascinating thing that I found about this show. So, evidently, the kids that are in this show, once they become old enough, they need to get rings to cement that they have become a man. So, is that kind of like their variation of bar mitzvah, I would assume? Which I was like, oh wow, okay, that's interesting. I wasn't familiar with that kind of stuff. But then we also have Earl that is condemning a man to death. The only thing is, you need everybody in the town to sign off on it, so everyone has to raise their hand to cement this man's death. I was like, holy crap! An entire town has to kill a man, and they have to be fine with it. What? So I guess that makes more sense than anything, because a king probably wants to sleep well at night, because everyone in town wanted this man dead as well, and it has to be unanimous. Everyone has to raise their hand, whether they want it to happen or not. So here's where we have these people eventually needing to get their heads chopped off, because ultimately they can choose the form of their destruction, which ultimately the man chooses to get his head chopped off. So these guys are going down the town square, and people are throwing fruit and lettuce at them, because if they don't, they will get fined. And again, that was like, oh wow, finally somebody justifies this. It's a little thing. You know how that little thing just has been burrowing in my head for I don't know how long. Whenever I'd watch these kinds of films, or shows, believe me, it's just been gnawing at me for I don't know how long, and finally there's a resolution to that, and I'm like, good, thank God for this show. Thank God for this show. They finally just been, why? Oh, the town gets fined? Ew. So, like the little kid, like is looking at one of the guys as he's like trudging down his sad little walk as people are throwing food at him, and he falls over and they splash him with water. And the kid doesn't want to throw lettuce or whatever at these people, but his father is telling him, you You have to do it. So everybody's throwing fruit. You have one guy who gets up who needs to get his head chopped off, and he's smiling, and they have to justify that as well. Or they justify that as well. I'm like, this show explains things. I like this. They also explained how they travel with a sundial and a moon and a moonstone, and I really enjoyed that too. I love the intelligence of this, like dumbing it down for a layman's person to just figure this out now. How they travel, because that's going to be a bigger thing. That's going to be a bigger thing when we get to the later part of this episode. So, guy gets his head chopped off. We find out that the king actually wanted his land, but he wouldn't give it up. So what easier way to finally get what he wants by just killing the man that is going to tell him no? Interesting. So, but we also know that the king eventually found all of his sons just dead in a ditch somewhere. I was like, what the heck is that? What the heck is that? All of his sons are dead? And you probably wonder why this guy is just ruling with an iron fist. Basically telling people that, like, if he looks at them the wrong way, he'll kill them. Or take their land. Or, like, basically, like, farming is very valuable. And if you're a farmer, if anybody just like, you know what? I want that farmland. I want to be able to have his food, so I will take it from him by taking his life. Man, this is interesting. So, and I want to watch more of it. And there was only 9. I think there was only 9 episodes in this first season. I so many shows, so many. So Vikings. So we have it to where Ragnar is going to the king and mentioning about taking a ship to the west, because they're getting nothing from the east. Rollo explains that when Ragnar explains about the sundial and stuff like that and the moonstone and trying to figure out how to travel and compasses and such, which I was like, oh wow, like, so there's some mathing things out of how to figure out how to travel. But so Ragnar eventually goes to the king and mentions about needing his ships to go west. Earl is basically telling him no. It's like, there's no way to justify just randomly going in any random direction. It doesn't matter where it is, to ultimately go west and assume that we're all of a sudden going to, like, have gold at the end of that rainbow, metaphorically saying. It's not the same thing that he said, but he couldn't justify going west. He didn't want to use the resources to go west, and then ultimately later on he pulls Ragnar aside, Earl does, and mentions how he disgraced him to his people. And then tells him, it's like, well, hey, you're a farmer. I'm going to take your land from you if you keep on doing what you're doing, because I will kill you and take it from you. Death threats. Interesting. Because supposedly this isn't the first time that Earl's feathers has been ruffled by Ragnar. So it's just like, you better watch yourself. On a short leash there, buddy. But so Ragnar eventually goes to some man, tries to get a sail, or tries to figure out how to make a sail of sorts. And so, towards the very end of this episode, we have them getting a boat together and seemingly sailing off. Not quite sure if a sail is actually going to work, but luckily it does. So I guess this is the invention of a sail, is also another portion of interesting aspects, because I think before everyone would just be rowing their way to anywhere. So now basically it's like, well, this boat is too big to justify having rowers. How about we just power this thing by sail? And then point it into a certain direction, which is, of course, west, to hope that we're going to get something out of this. So, I thought that was fascinating. I thought reasonably that's all I probably want to mention out of all this. And I know it's not into the 30-minute mark. I'm just kind of recantering or going back into as a conclusion to all this. And yeah, I don't think there is one. I enjoyed this. I was like, man, there's some interesting aspects about this show, and I hope it keeps going that route. I don't care if it has to explain every little thing. That's the intriguing part about it. Here's one thing that I forgot to mention that, again, was a romantic thing. We have Ragnar that is talking to his son and mentioning about how him and his wife had gotten together. We see in the battle scene where ultimately Ragnar someone throws a spear and hits a guy, which I thought that was a cool way to open the scene. In this story, Ragnar is talking to his son and mentioning how he won his wife over by seeing a bear and a hound at the same place at the same time, which I'm like, really? Maybe this story gets bigger every time. Every time they say it, which I think would be funny. Like, hey, did you ever hear the story about how me and your mom got together? Well, I killed 20 bears. That's how I won her over. No, there was a bear and a hound, and ultimately Ragnar speared the bear and evidently killed the bear, and then he took the hound and strangled it with his hands. And after doing all that, the Ragnar's wife was, of course, won over by him, and that's how the first time ever that evidently they fell in love for the first time. And ultimately, we have it cementing that things are going very well between this couple through this one episode. To where even the boy is sitting outside, to where Rollo walks in. He's like, "Hey, where's Ragnar?" It's like, well, him and my mom are having some bedroom business. And Ragnar is like, and Rollo's like, "Oh, okay, we'll just sit out here and wait for him then." And then Rollo knocks the kid over. But anyways, funny moment to end on. Funny, interesting story. I like this, and hopefully at the end of the day, you could say that you started watching this show and enjoying it, or if you already have, then it was an enjoyable show. And so I hope I can take the time to go into it more. So I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.